Addison attempts to declare that that's not really the case, that what he wants is a mixture of the two. That there's going to be certain things that will be nationalistic, like a national navy and other things like that, and the defense of the states and things like that, but there were essential features which were still federal in character. And this is what he says. He's in talking about ratification. He says, ratification is to be given by the people, not as individuals composing one entire nation. In other words, it wasn't going to be a plebiscite where everybody got to vote. Okay? Another example of not an initiative. All right? But as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. The act, therefore, of establishing the Constitution will not be a national but a federal act. Each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body independent of all the others and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. Okay? Which is why you could have a situation. What they didn't want to have is they didn't want to have a national one because you had states like New York and Virginia and others of the more populous states. If they would have made it just a plebiscite, they could have had big majorities in those states, which wasn't likely given where New York and Virginia were, but they wanted to make sure that each state was buying into this. Okay, and so they made it so that the decision had to be made at the state level. Yeah?
It wasn't a national plebiscite, but since this body, this convention, to ratify it, are made up of people who are going to determine what the supreme law of the land will be in accepting the Constitution, who appointed them? What kind of people are these that make up these constitutions?
Went to what, the Constitutional Convention?
Who makes up the constitutional conventions in the states that decide on the ratification of the supreme law of the land?
They were chosen by the people. The representatives
through the representatives, or just in a initiative, petition, vote?
I don't know if they were appointed. I don't know. I know in the Constitutional Convention, I believe they were all appointed by state legislatures.
Yeah.
Okay?
Because they were just supposed to be tinkering with the Articles of Confederation.
Right. I understand that.
Okay.
But then when it came time to ratify, where do these people come from?
I don't remember. I don't know the details.
That's funny that we wouldn't know who the sovereign people are that decide what the sovereign document is going to be and whether it's accepted or not.
So I don't know if it was these people were elected by popular election, or if they were if the ratifying conventions were appointments by the state legislatures, and I don't know the answer. And in fact, it could be different
Per state.
per state.
Yeah.
Okay. Question, Jeff?
Yeah, is that what this list of people is at the back of the Constitution?
Yes, those are the people who were at the Constitutional Convention.
Okay, they were at the convention?
Yes.
They were not people that ratified, they worked on
Well,
it?
some of them were. Some of them also then ended up being
Right.
at the state ratifying convention.
Right, but this is specifically the people that were there working on the Constitution.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
There's nobody from Rhode Island.
So, yeah, well, kind
But
of,
there are some from North Carolina.
yes.
Okay. Okay, well, I wondered, because it doesn't say what that is.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Okay. All right. Now, to kind of take you back a little bit in history, I thought it was interesting to kind of look at this again. And I just pull out some examples, and one of the things that is, sometimes I think it's really hard to discern in Scripture is when are the people acting as members of the assembly of the larger assembly, right? In other words, when are all men 20 years and above included in the act? And when are the people being represented by elders? Okay, and in many cases, I don't think it's necessarily clear. Here we have in Exodus 4, where Moses and Aaron gather together all the elders, right, of the people. So that's who's gathered, right? But then all of a sudden, it starts to not talk about the elders, it talks about the people. And the people believed. And see, I believe in those sections, what's happening is it's not every man 20 years older, 20 years and older that's there and that's seeing these miracles and believing, but it's the people's representatives, and therefore, the way Scripture records it is the people. Okay? Same thing in 2 Samuel 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. Now, lead out and bring in means took out to war. Okay? And the Lord said to you, you shall be a shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be a prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. This seems to be clearly a Republican and a federal act. Okay? And then in 1 Kings 12, you have the same kind of thing. In fact, we could have backed up a little earlier here, because if you remember Israel's history prior to this, is that this is finally when the nation reunites. You remember that after Saul dies, there's civil war between Saul's son and David. And initially it's only Judah and Judah that follows David. And all the other tribes are allied against David with Saul's son. But eventually, David does some diplomacy with Joab and with Amasa, even though poor Amasa ends up dead. But anyway, this is when they come together as all the tribes of Israel. And then, of course, the reverse happens under Rehoboam. When all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. So you have a situation here where the tribes are refusing to confirm the leadership of Rehoboam. And so I point this out, not to say that I believe that the founding fathers read these things and explicitly and intentionally said, we're going to do that because this is the way Israel did it. I think it's far more subtle than that. But these men were so aware of scriptural principles that it shaped the way they thought about things. Okay? And so they would naturally tend towards this direction, as opposed to explicitly and with great intention head toward. Now, I can't prove that right now, and David Barton may tell me 5 different reasons why that's not the case, but that's my belief at this point. And I just share that with you because I don't want us to take things too far, but I also want us to understand that the federal Constitution is something which comports well with Scripture, right? So, given that, how much time do we have left? None. So, no time to discuss.
Next week.
All right, we'll start next week. So I'll pass on this. Next week is our kind of our open discussion time. So if you guys don't come prepared, it's going to be coffee time. All right? Herb and I want to know what you guys have actually learned. And I want, we want to hear from you, and we want you to share with other people kind of what, what's happening to your thinking as a result of spending all the hours you spent in this class. Right? We don't do this just because we need to kill an hour on Sunday morning. I want to know also what questions have arisen. This is a time maybe when questions that have come up we haven't had time to address or have skipped over or whatever, we could bring those up. The other thing is Herb and I are very concerned that it's easy to be overwhelmed and to feel like things are so far off the rails there's no way we can get back. What can I as a single person do? And I think we should talk about that next week as well. We're kind of taking this break at the end of the main part of the Constitution. We'll do this, and then we're going to come back and go through the amendments. But I wanted to take a break because I just felt like over the last few weeks people were kind of feeling overwhelmed. And I wanted to take some time to digest what we've been through. And so I'll back up just a second to the slide before. How does the Constitution actually reflect a worldview, a biblical worldview? Is it in consonant with a biblical worldview? Or are there areas where it might actually be contrary to a biblical worldview? One thing I wanted to also point out to you, or a question I was going to ask you, and you can think about this for next week, is how might the fact that the overwhelming majority of Americans at the time of the founding were Protestant have affected our Constitution? How might our Constitution have ended up differently, right, if we'd have been, let's say, a predominantly Catholic nation? because I think it would have. And I'm not going to tell you why, but you know, even just thinking about our current Constitution, how would that have ended up differently if we'd have had different fundamental presuppositions about certain things?